everyone, welcome back. So, today we will talk about another important topics in security that almost everyone should know about. That is SAML. SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. Quite a big name. Well, let's go and understand. Well, this is a language for systems to communicate with each other to basically do something. Now, what is that something? All the applications and services that we have, they need to talk to each other, right? And they need to understand for all the users who say who they are, that's where SAML comes in. Let's go dig deeper into it. To understand SAML, we also need to understand another important term in security industry, which is SSO, single sign-on. Well, what is single sign-on? Single sign-on, just imagine you need to provide and authenticate a user, but you don't want them to authenticate every single time. You just sign on once. Once you have done that, other systems can take a look at that and then authenticate you moving forward and getting you access to all the applications. Now, think of SAML authentication. Again, authentication, not authorization. Two different things. Authentication is in SAML. SAML authentication is more like an identification card. So when somebody says, this is who I am, SAML works in that way. So look like this one, right? You do a series of DNA tests, ideally, to understand that what is someone's identity. Is it probably too much, right? If you want to see somebody to let them enter, you are not going to do DNA test for them. You probably just want to look at their ID card and see what they are. And that's what SAML does. Once you enter, you don't need to again and again go and take a look at their identity card to check whether they are trusted or not trusted and things like that. So let's go and dig deeper. In the computer networking world, the biggest challenge is for our devices and our computer systems for different vendors to, work together. And this is where the concept of interoperability comes in, that different machines have to talk to each other. In this way, SAML is the way to provide that interoperable standard between two systems to talk to each other. And that's where one of the most important uses of that becomes the single sign-on. The users only need to be authenticated to the applications only once. Once they have done that, users at the single login screen, they can use to get number of applications that they have. Users don't need to confirm their identity with every single service that they use. In this way, the SSO must communicate each other for the external app to tell them that the user has already signed in. They don't need to log in now again. So that's where the whole concept of SAML, the big interoperability standard. Now, let's go and understand how this eventually works under this hood. There are three big parties that are involved over here. One is the principal, which we also call subject. The second is the identity provider, and then we have the service provider. Now, let's go dig deeper into each one of them. The principal or the subject is basically nothing but a human user, who is trying to access the cloud hosted application. So if I'm the person who wants to go enter into a system, I'm the principal or the subject over here. The identity provider is a cloud service basically hosting my identity in the system. And that probably will be needed through the login process. So if you think about the IDP's role, the identity provider is basically this. I know this person and here is what they are even allowed to do. And that's where the SSO system, they may in fact be separate from IDP. But in those cases, the SSO eventually acts as the representative for the IDP. Yeah. And that's what the identity provider does. Hey, I know this person and I know what they really want to do, and this is what we want to let them do. The third biggest piece in here is the service provider. Now, what is service provider? The service provider could be anything. It could be a cloud hosted application, or it could be, if I really want to go and log into, for example, AWS, or I want to use Google Drive, I can use those services, and those are the service provider. A user can log into these services directly whenever an SSO is used. So user, let's just say, logs into the SSO, and the SAML between the identity provider, the system which stores all the identities, and the service provider which is providing these services, uses SAML between them to give them the access instead of a direct login. So think about this, right? Let's try to understand how the typical flow will look like. So here's the principle. He goes and makes a request to the service provider, right? So I go in there and I say, hey, I need to go and log into www.sassy.com, for example, right? But to log into sassy.com, that's the service provider. Sassy.com will go and say, do you want to use any other system to log into our system? And you say, yeah, I have all my passwords stored in Office 365 Microsoft, and that's your identity provider, right? And that basically service provider, Microsoft the sassy.com requests the authentication from Microsoft. So I am the service provider and I request authentication from Microsoft, which is the identity provider in this case. The identity provider sends me a SAML assertion. Important, right? So the service provider sends me a SAML assertion to the service provider. And then as me in the sassy.com, which is me, service provider, will send a response directly, give them the access, and all I need to do is just send a response to the principal that, hey, you are authenticated now because your identity matched. Now, if the principal was not already logged in, the identity provider may prompt them to log in before sending that SAML assertion. So if I'm there, this is my first time I'm logging in, I have to enter my username passwords. But once that is done, the service provider, knows that the SAML has been received from the identity provider and they're ready to go and you can log in. So that's the overall flow of the whole identity provider and service provider. Now, let's move on to the next one, which is when we talked about this term in here, which is SAML assertion. Now, what does that mean? Basically, SAML assertion is a message that a service provider, which tells the service provider that a user is signed in. That's basically it is. Now, what is in that SAML assertion? It has all the messages that the service provider can confirm that is what the user's identity is. So it requires all the information. So it could have a source of the assertion, it could have a time that it was issued, and the conditions that make that assertion valid. Basically, it's a kind of an XML file which has all that data in it to verify if that person is there, that identity. Now, think of even like if you have to think about giving an example of SAML assertion, let's just say a reference for a job candidate, right? Now, the person providing the reference will tell them that this is how much the person has worked here for, this is what their role was, so on and so forth, right? Now, as a company, if I'm getting somebody's reference, then I can make a decision whether to hire the candidate or not, or whether to even interview them or not. And that's where that SAML assertion is more like that data of the person that we get, and based upon that data, we understand whether to trust the user or not. Now, in SAML, it has gone through different iterations of it. The one which is the most common one now is the modern version of SAML that we have, SAML 2.0. Now, the SAML 1.01 has a backward compatibility, but the SAML 2.0 is the modern standard that the systems use today to interoperate with each other. And this is where the whole concept of, again, interoperability comes in. Now, wrapping this whole topic about SAML, the last thing I want to talk about that a lot of folks get confused, and that is the concept again of authentication and authorization. SAML works at authentication, not authorization. Again, let's talk about that. Authentication is who they are and what their identity is, maybe by a login process, right? Authorization is the user's privileges or permissions. What actions can they perform within the company system? Two different concepts. So SAML is in the authentication one. Now, there is also a very important thing that we need to understand. Is there something, a standard which works at the authorization layer? There is. There is another one which is very prevalent, which is called OAuth. And we will learn about OAuth in a next video. So we need to understand that this SAML authentication is not the same thing as the user authorization. So this works at that authentication layer. So this is all about SAML. It's a very large topic and there is so much else to cover as well. But I hope this video was really beneficial for you and I'll see you in one of the next videos. Take care. Bye-bye. Signing out.